Hello YouTube and Westworld fans. So if you've been watching Season 1 of Westworld carefully, you know how difficult it has been to follow along and decipher the clues left by showrunners Jonathan Nolan and Lisa Joy in this sci-fi western series. If you've not caught up to episode 8 yet, I would recommend leaving as this video will include spoilers from this episode as well as the ones prior. Otherwise, this video is going to examine and explain all the relevant theories surrounding the show leading up to the ending of Season 1. There have been many mysteries surrounding the storylines in this show, and this video should help clarify what has happened so far and what we should expect from the closing episodes. So if you find yourself questioning the nature of your reality, then this video is for you. To begin this video, I'm going to first talk about the time periods we are seeing in Westworld. So as many viewers have already noticed, there seems to be multiple time periods that are occurring throughout the show. This video is going to discuss that theory as it appears to have the most supporting evidence. And if you are indeed a doubter of the multiple time period theory, all I ask is that you stick around in this video as I will address the scenes and circumstances that seem to contradict this theory and demonstrate how the showrunners have been manipulating the audience all along. So let's begin. If you haven't caught on yet, Westworld seems to use 3 different time periods in the show to tell the greater story. These time periods are the present, 30 years ago, which is the time of the last critical failure, and 34 to 35 years ago, which is the time when Arnold was killed in the park. Now the first time period I'm going to discuss is the present. This storyline includes the Man in Black, Teddy, Lawrence, Wyatt, Maeve, Sylvester and Felix, as well as Bernard and the management team in the park. As you know, most of this time period revolves around the Man in Black's quest for the maze. Initially, his quest included him dragging around Lawrence, and now he's been taking around Teddy to find Wyatt. However, this isn't the only storyline in the present. It also includes Maeve's attempt to leave the compound, Ford's various battles with management and the board, and the revelation that Bernard is actually a host. Now, the last major plot in the present time period is Dolores, but we have to remember that her story is very complicated, as she seems to be the key to distinguishing these 3 time periods that we're going to discuss. Dolores is an unreliable narrator, as her scenes often include the present as well as memories from her past time periods. And to top that off, Dolores has followed the same paths in these time periods, which has allowed the directors to use deceptive editing to trick the viewer into thinking that the events are occurring on the same timeline. If this is confusing, don't worry, I'm going to discuss this in depth and show examples of this later in this video, but keep that in mind moving forward. Next, we have the time period around 30 years ago. This storyline includes William, Dolores, Logan, El Lazo, which is Lawrence, and the Confederados. So right now you're probably wondering, where did he determine this storyline occurs 30 years in the past? And the answer is directly related to another popular theory that has been floating around the show for some time. That theory is that William is actually the Man in Black during his first visit to the park nearly 30 years ago. Now for this segment, I'm not going to explain why William is likely the Man in Black in detail, because there is another segment later on in this video that will examine the clues and explain why scenes that contradict this theory are actually diversions. But for now, I would just like to show that if William was a young Man in Black, then based on the conversations by the Man in Black, it appears that his first visit to the park happens to be around 30 years ago, which also happens to be around the time that the park suffered its last critical failure. How many times have we heard the Man in Black remind us that he's been going to the park for nearly 30 years? There's clearly a reason we are reminded this over and over, and we'll talk more about this later on in the video. Finally, the last time period occurs between 34 to 35 years ago, when the park was still in its test phase. This storyline includes Dolores, Arnold, Ford, and all the original hosts at the church. In this time period, flashbacks seem to indicate that Dolores goes crazy and kills the hosts in a massacre by the church. Now there is one more set of scenes that are likely from this time period, but they can be very controversial in terms of the story. And those are the scenes between Bernard and Dolores in one of the diagnostic basements. But wait, Bernard wasn't around during this time period, so how can he be interviewing Dolores then? And it's these questions that lead us to another major theory in the show, that the scenes in the diagnostic chamber are not between Bernard and Dolores, but rather between Arnold and Dolores nearly 35 years ago. Those scenes likely represent the time period where Arnold was changing Dolores' core code, trying to obtain consciousness. It is also the point that Arnold first introduces the concept of the maze to Dolores. I'll talk more about Arnold later in this video, but first let's look at the Man in Black and William. So as I mentioned earlier, the evidence surrounding the Man in Black being William seems to be overwhelming at this point. As many of you know, the first hints of this theory started when the viewers noticed the multiple time periods in the show. It began with the Westworld logo. As William arrives at the park, he walks past a screen with the Westworld logo that looks different from the modern looking logo that we see in scenes from the present timeline. We also saw the old logo 2 other times, once in a flashback during Ford's conversation with Bernard about Arnold, and twice when Bernard went to check the legacy Westworld system that had been decommissioned for years. Ultimately, the logo led viewers to believe that William and Logan's story occurred in the past. Then the hints towards William being the Man in Black started to become more apparent as the season continued to drop more subtleties in the show. For example, at the end of episode 2, when William first meets Dolores during the scene where she drops the can, we hear Ford talking about how the guests come back because they find something they love. The indirect message was that William had likely returned to Westworld multiple times after his first visit, just as we know the Man in Black had. But it doesn't stop there. What about in episode 4 when the Man in Black was telling Lawrence that Westworld was a story and he just wanted to read the last page? And then in episode 7 when we heard William talking to Dolores and telling her that all he had when he was a kid was books and that all he wanted to do was wake up as a character in those stories. Or how about in episode 5 when the Man in Black said an old friend used to say that there was a path for everyone, which was an allusion to Dolores telling William that she believed that people had paths to follow. Or even in that same conversation, the Man in Black tells Lawrence that no one would take that kind of tone he did with him except in a past life, which was another allusion to how Logan spoke to William in the past. Or what about the fact that we recently discovered that the Man in Black was married for 30 years, which is consistent with William telling Dolores that when he gets home he is going to get married to Logan's sister? I mean, I could actually go on, as the hints are so subtle and abundant that supports the idea that William is likely the young Man in Black. But what about the scenes that contradict this theory? Let's talk about those next. So one of the arguments against William being the Man in Black is that the show has included scenes that contradict the theory from a chronological standpoint. For example, how could William's time period be in the past if the memory of the Man in Black caused Dolores to shoot the host in the barn and escape via horse to William? Or if Stubbs is in the present, why did he state that Dolores was off her loop when she was with William if William is in the past? The answer is deceptive editing. Jonathan Nolan is notorious for deceptive editing in his movies, and it appears he has brought this talent to the show. So the key here is that Dolores is an unreliable narrator. In the show, we are exposed to her story in 3 different time periods, which makes it confusing to decipher what is happening in what order. And Nolan has further complicated the situation by intertwining scenes from the past with scenes from the present. Because Dolores has gone down these loops before, we see scenes where she is in the present in one frame, and then in the past in a completely different frame with the same exact loop being played out. So for example, when Dolores arrives in the town and sees Lawrence's daughter pointing to the maze, that is actually the present. Then it switches to Stubbs, who recognizes Dolores is off her loop, which has already been set in motion by the Man in Black in the present. When the little girl disappears and the sheriff and William arrives, that scene is in the past. So Stubbs didn't send that sheriff to bring back Dolores. It was simply a scene from 30 years before when a host tried to get Dolores back on her loop. And it's this type of editing that has been used to trick viewers throughout the show to make the multiple time period theory ambiguous. There are more than a handful of scenes where if you rewatch them, you will see that they are filmed in a specific way to make the viewer question the time period and the characters involved in the scenes. And if you look at all the scenes in that light, you can see how the time periods stay consistent with the idea that William and the Man in Black are on different storylines, but the same person. So now that we've established that William is likely the Man in Black, the real question is, what happened 30 years ago? It appears that Dolores has led William on her quest to find the maze, following Arnold's intentions from 5 years before. She even hears Arnold's voice from before trying to direct her the way he did before the park was opened. But as a viewer, we are aware of two incidents in the park. The first was when Arnold died before the park opened. This likely included the scenes where Dolores kills the people in the town with the church. And the second is some unknown event during William's timeline. We know this because in the present, they refer to an accident that happened 30 years ago. And the Man in Black himself even states that he prevented Arnold from taking the park with him 30 years ago as well. So apparently, William's story will likely show the incident from 30 years ago. This brings me to my next point about what to expect from the ending of the show. We've seen how Dolores and William have fallen in love during the course of their narrative, but clearly the Man in Black has no affection for Dolores or any characters in the park for that matter, which is a stark contrast from William. This has led me to the conclusion that Dolores and William's storyline ends tragically, and I assume that how it transpires is likely the critical failure that is alluded to in the present. Honestly, it could be an array of things. Maybe Dolores figures out a way to kill and kills Logan. She does have flashbacks to the gun that was hidden in the dirt. Does she use that to kill someone? Or does she betray William in her attempt to find the maze and be free? And will William be forced to harm Dolores as he realizes she isn't real? I almost guarantee the ending of the show will answer these lingering questions, along with the mystery of Arnold and his story, which brings me to my next topic I want to address. So as I mentioned earlier, there's substantial evidence that Bernard is actually a host replica of Arnold built by Ford. He appears to be built years after the real Arnold was killed, but the scenes with Arnold and Dolores in the diagnostic chamber were from 35 years ago when Arnold was first tampering with her code to try to give her consciousness. As you can see, Arnold wears different attire from Bernard, which we never see Bernard wear. On top of that, Bernard's backstory might actually be Arnold's real-life backstory. In episode 3, Ford tells Bernard that Arnold's personal life was marked by tragedy, which led him to get close to the host and become reclusive. It is entirely possible that Arnold actually had a son that died, and that Ford knew this and gave Bernard that life story. Remember, Ford said that Arnold made Ford's replica family and told him that artists always hid themselves in their work. Would it be a surprise if Ford made Bernard as a tribute to Arnold? Furthermore, we have two other scenes that might be revisited if the Bernard is Arnold theory is true. Remember when Ford first told Bernard the story of Arnold and the picture he shows him has a space for another person? Maybe it was Bernard who couldn't see himself, which looks like Arnold, because he's a host and they can't see things that harm them. The same goes for the schematic that Teresa picks up and shows Bernard. The other schematics have names attached to them, but when Bernard looks at his name isn't displayed. Could it be that the name on the drawing is actually Arnold? These might be things that the showrunners reveal to the viewer at the end of the series, along with the lingering mystery of how Arnold died and how Dolores played a role in the first failure before the opening of the park. We're also likely going to get answers about the present storylines and how they pan out. Will the Man in Black find the maze? And what is it? Is it a place? A state of existence for the host? The Man in Black tells Lawrence that he wants to set them free. How does the maze play a role in that? We know the Man in Black has been terrorizing the host to get them to remember the past. Why? Does finding the maze allow hosts to remember the past? To gain consciousness, perhaps? And why would he want that? I'm assuming, if so, that Dolores has something to do with it. And has the maze remained the same? What if Arnold's maze was different from the current maze? What if Arnold's maze allowed the host to gain consciousness or memory, but the current maze, which is likely controlled by Ford, is a trap to see if the hosts have become too aware? I think we'll have the answer to that soon. And lastly, we'll likely get to see the ending of Maeve's storyline. Will she assemble an army of aware hosts to break out of the complex? Or is Ford just watching and waiting for her to make the wrong move? He did say that he controls everything. Could Felix and Sylvester be hosts too, and Ford is just seeing what they're all going to do? With Ford's assertion that he oversees everything in the park, it just seems too unrealistic that Maeve's actions have gone unnoticed, especially after we saw the scene in episode 8 where her cognition was fragmented. She was wiped by Ford and then stabbed herself immediately after she was wiped. Wouldn't you assume that Ford would be keeping a close eye on her if he didn't retire her? And the final note that I want to leave you with is Stubbs' reaction to his conversation with Bernard. He seemed troubled by Bernard's denial of a relationship with Teresa. He clearly knew what was going on, but seemed taken aback by Bernard's response. Will his suspicion lead Stubbs to watch Bernard, and what will he learn about him? At this point, we can only wait and see what will happen when episode 9 of Westworld premieres on November 27th on HBO. Thank you for watching this video, and make sure to like it and share it with your friends if you feel it has provided you with insight into this first season of Westworld. Also, make sure to subscribe to my channel for more Westworld videos as well as other related content. Take care.